Hi, my name's Justin Horn. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to participate in this year's online undergraduate ethics conference, and in particular to have the opportunity to comment on Phil Yaure's very thought-provoking paper, Evolutionary Ethics and the Moral Skeptic. I really enjoyed reading Phil's paper, and I thought it had many virtues. It's original, it's clear, it's well organized, and it engages with an exciting and very much alive debate in metaethics about the implications of evolution for the way that we think about morality. Phil begins his paper by briefly sketching Robert Richards' account of evolutionary ethics, and then presents an objection to it raised by Richard Joyce in The Evolution of Morality. Phil then goes on to advance two key claims in his paper. First, he argues that Joyce's specific objection fails. In particular, Phil claims that it falls prey to a classic Aristotelian insight. Second, Phil argues that Joyce's objection to Richard's version of evolutionary ethics could be effective if only it were directed at a different stage in Richard's argument. In these comments, I will raise a worry for each of these two central claims. So let's start with the first one. According to Phil, one of Joyce's main objections to Richard's evolutionary ethics is that the theory is unable to provide a compelling answer to the moral skeptic, that is, to an individual who refuses to accept any positive moral judgments. Phil attributes to Joyce the view that the whole point of a moral theory is to persuade one who doesn't already more or less share its views on moral matters. Next, Phil quite sensibly claims that this conception of the aim of moral theory sets the bar too high. Providing an argument that would persuade a die-hard skeptic is not necessary in order to justify a moral theory. On the contrary, as Aristotle pointed out, we should not expect even sound moral arguments to persuade those who lack the requisite maturity and wisdom to appreciate them. This reply strikes me as sensible so far as it goes, but I worry that Phil has in fact misconstrued Joyce's point in the relevant passage. In the context under discussion, Joyce is not objecting to the moral principles endorsed by Richards, but to a particularly bold logical claim that Richards makes, namely that there are rules of inference that license deductive inferences from entirely descriptive premises to moral conclusions. If Richards were correct about this, then some sets of descriptive claims would logically entail certain moral claims, so that a moral skeptic who accepted the relevant descriptive claims while denying the relevant moral claims would actually be logically inconsistent. If this were so, the moral skeptic would turn out to be not only morally flawed, but actually logically deficient. So why should we accept that surprising conclusion? Well, according to Richards, we should do so because such inference principles can be derived from, quote, the beliefs and practices of moral people, end quote. Just as, according to Richards, we can vindicate modus ponens by showing that it, quote, renders valid the same arguments that rational men consider valid, end quote. It is in responding to this claim that Joyce makes the remark to which Phil objects. So according to Joyce, quote, the challenge of deriving aught from is, as it is classically conceived, is to try to convince a sensible moral skeptic that her sensible acceptance of various relevant empirical data logically commits her to certain moral conclusions, end quote. So that's Joyce's remark. Joyce's point here, I take it, is not about anything so grand as the whole point of moral theory, as Phil puts it. Rather, it seems to me that Joyce is getting at something like this. While moral skepticism is in some ways a radical position, moral skeptics can surely have a firm grasp of logic. A moral skeptic might well grasp relations of entailment between propositions just as well as the moral realist. But if an ought claim is logically entailed by an is claim, then an inference from the latter to the former is warranted by inference rules that all logically competent speakers would accept. By claiming that special inference rules can be derived from the practices of a subset of people, a subset of rational people even, namely the moral ones, Richard implausibly suggests that good moral character is necessary in order to grasp the soundness of certain inferences. Rather than taking up the burden of explaining to the moral skeptic why moral obligations follow from non-moral claims she already accepts, Richard simply accuses the moral skeptic of a kind of logical blindness. It is this particular move to which Joyce objects, rather than Richard's general inability to persuade the moral skeptic of the truth of his favored moral principles. If we understand Joyce's criticism in this way, I think it's perfectly consistent with the Aristotelian point that Phil advances. Okay, so I've just raised a worry for Phil's criticism of Joyce, and I've argued that Joyce's aim in invoking the moral skeptic in this context is more modest than Phil seems to suppose. But Phil goes on to argue that Joyce's invocation of the moral skeptic does have force against Richards if it is raised at a different point in the dialectic. This is because for Richards to have succeeded in providing a plausible moral theory, his account must yield verdicts about what we ought to do. And crucially, this ought cannot be merely an ought of prediction, of the sort we use when we say, oh, he ought to be arriving any minute now. Rather, any adequate moral theory must yield verdicts about what we ought to do, where this ought carries some normative authority, or what Joyce calls practical clout. Phil claims that the problem for Richards is that he cannot give any explication of this distinction between these two sorts of ought that would make his position distinguishable from a moral skeptic who accepts judgments about what predictively ought to happen, but not about what normatively ought to happen. In arguing that this presents a problem for Richards, and for naturalistic ethics generally, Phil considers and rejects three possible ways of clearly making the distinction between the two kinds of ought claims. Although I agree that none of the three ways of drawing the distinction that Phil considers are very promising, for reasons that he ably points out, it seems to me that there's a distinct and fairly straightforward way of distinguishing between predictive and normative oughts. Predictive ought claims are tied to expectations. To say that something ought to happen in the predictive sense is to say that something will likely happen. If one predictively claims that something ought to happen, and then it fails to happen, the appropriate response would seem to be surprise. Normative ought claims are different. To say that S normatively ought to do X is not to say that S will in fact do X, or even that this is remotely likely. We often make normative ought claims that we know perfectly well will not be satisfied. For example, I believe that every state in the US ought to abolish the death penalty immediately. Of course, I don't expect that to happen. Alas, such is the world. Normative ought claims, rather, are tied to judgments about reasons and blameworthiness. To say that S normatively ought to do X is to say that S has a reason to do X, and if S fails to do X without any adequate excuse, S is worthy of some degree of blame. While much more could be said to make the relevant notions more precise, there doesn't seem to me to be any worry about confusing predictive ought with the normative one. Indeed, Richard Joyce himself, despite being a confessed moral skeptic, does not claim to have any trouble understanding the distinction. On the contrary, one of Joyce's criticisms of Richards is that the theory of evolutionary ethics that Richards provides seems only to ground claims about what people predictively ought to do, rather than what they normatively ought to do. Since any adequate moral theory will tell us what we normatively ought to do, Joyce insists, Richards' theory is inadequate. This is a potentially serious objection, but it's distinct from the one that Phil raises about the inability to explicate any meaningful distinction between these two senses of ought. So in conclusion, I've raised two worries for Phil's paper. First, I've argued that he misconstrues the aim of Joyce's invocation of the moral skeptic in response to Richards, and that for this reason, Phil's sensible Aristotelian point fails to refute Joyce's particular objection. Second, I've argued that distinguishing between predictive and normative senses of ought is not quite so difficult as Phil suggests. Despite these criticisms, I think Phil gives us much to chew on in thinking about the prospects of a naturalistic or even an evolutionary ethics. So thanks again to Phil and to the organizers of this conference, particularly David Kaloran, for making this all happen. I look forward to seeing the other contributions to the conference.